The smell of burnt wiring still hung in the maintenance corridor when Daniel Cole heard the screaming start again. It was not the first time. For 6 days now, the medical wing of the Kethrin Dominion's central station had echoed with the cries of a dying hatchling, and for 6 days, nobody had been able to stop them. Daniel was not a healer. He was not a scientist, or a soldier, or anyone important at all. He fixed air filters and coolant lines, crawling through narrow service shafts that no Draucari would ever lower themselves to enter. Humanity had joined the Dominion only a few years ago, and in that time, humans had been given exactly one kind of job, the kind nobody else wanted. He turned a corner with his tool case in hand, heading toward a broken vent near the nursery wing, when the screaming stopped. It did not fade. It did not grow quiet slowly, the way pain usually does when medicine finally works. It simply stopped, all at once, the instant Daniel stepped into view of the containment chamber. Inside, behind a shimmering blue field of energy, lay a small dragon. Its scales were a dull gray, the color sickness leaves behind, and its ribs showed clearly beneath its skin. It could not have been more than a few weeks old. Around it stood 3 Draucari healers in ceremonial robes, each one carrying instruments Daniel did not recognize, each one looking utterly exhausted. The hatchling's head turned. Its eyes, a pale gold, fixed directly on Daniel. One of the healers, an older Draucari with silver markings along his jaw, followed the hatchling's gaze and frowned. "Human," he said, his translator implant giving the word a flat, cold edge. "You are not permitted here." Daniel raised both hands slowly. "I was just heading to the vent behind you. I didn't mean to interrupt anything." But the hatchling was not looking away. It pushed itself up on trembling legs, something it apparently had not done in days, judging by the surprised murmurs among the healers. It stumbled toward the edge of the containment field, toward Daniel, and let out a small, weak sound that was nothing like the screaming from before. It sounded almost like relief. The healers exchanged glances. The oldest one stepped closer to the field, speaking softly to the hatchling in the Draucari tongue, but the creature ignored him completely, its attention locked on the human standing awkwardly by the doorway. "This is not possible," the healer muttered. Daniel shifted his weight, uncomfortable under the sudden attention. "What's wrong with it?" "That is not your concern," the healer snapped, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. He turned back to the hatchling and tried again, laying a clawed hand gently against the field. The hatchling flinched away from him and pressed itself closer to the barrier nearest Daniel. For 6 days, every healer in the sector had tried to treat this hatchling. Biomancers who could mend broken bones with a thought. Psychic surgeons who could untangle the mind of the sick. Elder priests who had healed hatchlings for over 100 years. Every single one had been rejected, some gently, some violently, the hatchling thrashing and screaming until they backed away. And now it stood calm, its trembling stopped, staring at a human maintenance worker who had wandered in by accident. A second healer, younger, with quick nervous movements, tapped something into a data pad. "Vitals are stabilizing. Heart rate is dropping toward normal range. This has not happened since it hatched." "Nothing," Daniel said honestly. "I just walked in." The 3 healers spoke quickly among themselves in low voices, too fast for the translator to catch clearly. Daniel caught only fragments. Words like impossible and bloodline and cannot report this. The hatchling made another small sound, softer this time, almost a chirp, and pressed one clawed foot against the inside of the field, as close to Daniel as it could get. Daniel had grown up around animals. Before the Dominion came to Earth and folded humanity into its endless hierarchy of species, he had worked as a veterinary technician in a small clinic outside a city that did not exist to anyone in this station, on a planet most of the crew here had never heard of. He had held frightened dogs during thunderstorms. He had calmed horses with broken legs. He knew what fear looked like in a creature too weak to run from it. And this hatchling was terrified. Not of him, of everyone else. "Can I ask what's wrong with it?" Daniel said again, quieter this time. The older healer studied him for a long moment, his silver markings catching the chamber's dim light. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with something that sounded almost like defeat. "It is dying." Daniel looked back at the hatchling. Its gold eyes had not left him once. "Then maybe," Daniel said slowly, not fully understanding what he was about to offer, "it doesn't want your kind of help." The words hung in the chamber, and even the hatchling seemed to go still, as if it were listening. The healers stared at Daniel as though he had said something dangerous. Somewhere above them, in the higher levels of the station, alarms had already begun quietly notifying the Dominion's ruling council that something unprecedented had just happened in the medical wing. None of them, not the healers, not Daniel, and certainly not the hatchling, yet understood how much that single moment was about to change. Word travels fast in a place where nothing interesting ever happens to the maintenance crew, and by the time Daniel finished his shift, half the human workers on the station already knew his name. He had not wanted the attention. He had spent the rest of that day fixing the same broken vent he had originally been sent to repair, half expecting to be scolded for wandering into a restricted medical wing. Instead, 2 station guards were waiting for him outside the crew quarters, their armor polished, their expressions unreadable. "You are to come with us," one of them said. It was not a request. Daniel followed them through corridors he had never been allowed into before, past sealed doors with markings he could not read, until they reached a private council chamber near the top of the station. 5 Draucari sat around a curved table, their robes marking them as members of the ruling council, the kind of officials Daniel had only ever seen from a distance during formal announcements. At the head of the table sat a Draucari woman with deep blue scales and calm, sharp eyes. She studied Daniel the way someone studies a puzzle piece that does not seem to belong to the picture. "You are the human from the medical wing," she said. It was not really a question. "Yes," Daniel said. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." "You did not cause trouble," she replied. "You caused something far more complicated. A miracle, perhaps, or an inconvenience. We have not yet decided which." She gestured, and a screen above the table lit up, showing a live feed of the containment chamber. The hatchling lay curled in the corner nearest the door, its breathing steady but shallow, its gold eyes half open and fixed on the entrance as though waiting for something. "The hatchling has not eaten in 4 days," the woman continued. "It refuses all nourishment offered by our healers. It refuses medicine. It refuses even simple comfort. And yet the moment you appeared, its vital signs improved for the first time since it hatched." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know why. I've never seen a dragon before today, not a real one anyway." "Neither have most humans," she said. "That hatchling is not an ordinary creature. It carries a bloodline that produces perhaps 1 telepathic hatchling in a generation. Its mind reaches outward before it can even speak, searching for something. We do not fully understand what, but it has chosen you, out of every healer, every scientist, every Draucari on this station." One of the other council members, an older male with silver markings that reminded Daniel of the healer from earlier, leaned forward with obvious displeasure. "This is unacceptable. A bloodline heir bonding with a laborer species. It insults centuries of tradition." "Tradition has not kept it alive," the woman said sharply, silencing him. She turned back to Daniel. "We are asking you to return to the chamber. Sit with it. Nothing more. If it calms in your presence, perhaps it will finally accept treatment." Daniel glanced at the screen again. The hatchling had shifted slightly, as if sensing it was being discussed. "I'm not a healer," Daniel said. "I don't know the first thing about dragons." "No," the woman agreed. "But you may be the only reason it survives the week." There was no real choice in her tone, only the shape of a request wrapped around an order. Daniel thought of the small, trembling creature pressed against the containment field, the way its screaming had stopped so suddenly, the way it had looked at him like he was the only solid thing in a world made of pain. "All right," he said. "I'll try." They led him back down to the medical wing, past healers who watched him with a mixture of curiosity and quiet resentment, until he stood once more before the containment field. The moment the hatchling saw him, it lifted its head, and though it did not move closer this time, its tail gave a slow, tired sweep across the floor, something almost like a greeting. The healers dropped the field just enough to let Daniel step inside, then sealed it again quickly behind him, as though worried he might change his mind and run. Daniel lowered himself carefully to the floor a few feet from the hatchling, keeping his movements slow the way he always had with frightened animals back home. He did not reach for it. He did not speak in the calm, practiced tones the healers used. He simply sat and waited and let the silence stretch. After a long moment, the hatchling shuffled closer, dragging its weak body across the floor until it rested its head lightly against Daniel's knee. Its breathing, which had been shallow and uneven all day, began to slow into something steadier. Daniel let out a breath he had not realized he was holding and, without really thinking about it, reached down and rested a hand gently on the hatchling's scaled neck. Nothing dramatic happened. No light show, no sudden burst of energy. Just a small, sick creature finally allowing itself to rest, for the first time since it had been born into a world of powerful healers who did not know how to simply be still with something that was afraid. Outside the chamber, unseen by either of them, the older healer with silver markings watched the monitors with a tight, unreadable expression, already composing in his mind the report he intended to send to the higher authorities of the Dominion. By the fourth day, the improvement was slow but steady. The hatchling had begun eating again, small portions at first, offered by Daniel's own hand rather than any medical device. It still refused every healer who approached, curling away from their instruments and their careful, clinical voices, but it never once turned away from Daniel. He had learned things about it that the Draucari healers, for all their advanced science, had somehow missed. It liked to be near warmth, so he had asked for extra heating panels in the chamber. It calmed when he spoke quietly, not in any special language, just ordinary words, the way he used to talk to frightened animals back on Earth, telling them everything was fine even when he was not entirely sure it was true. It did not like sudden movements or bright lights, things that had never occurred to the Draucari to consider, since their own hatchlings were raised very differently. "You are treating it like an animal," said the older healer one afternoon, standing just outside the containment field with his arms crossed. His name, Daniel had learned, was Magistrate Healer Richthin, a title that came with considerable authority within the medical caste, and clearly a good deal of wounded pride as well. "It is an animal," Daniel said simply, not looking up from where he sat brushing dust gently from the hatchling's scales. "A young one. Scared and hurting. That's all it is right now, titles or no titles." Richthin's jaw tightened. "It is the heir to one of the oldest bloodlines in the Dominion. It deserves proper care, not the crude instincts of an unskilled laborer." Daniel did not rise to the insult. He had noticed, over the past few days, that whenever Richthin raised his voice near the chamber, the hatchling's breathing grew quick and uneven, its small body curling tighter against Daniel's side. He kept his own voice low and even, partly for the hatchling's sake, partly because he simply was not the type to shout back. "Maybe," Daniel said, "your kind of proper care is exactly what it's scared of." Richthin said nothing more, but the look he gave Daniel before turning away carried a weight that suggested this conversation was far from finished. That evening, after most of the medical staff had left for the night cycle, Daniel sat alone with the hatchling in the dim chamber. It had grown enough strength now to climb halfway into his lap, its small clawed feet tucked beneath its own body, its gold eyes drifting closed as he spoke softly about nothing in particular, just the sound of a familiar voice filling the quiet. He was in the middle of describing, of all things, the small clinic where he used to work, back before Earth had even known aliens existed, when something strange happened. A warmth spread through his mind, gentle at first, like sunlight through a window. Images that were not his own began to surface at the edges of his thoughts. A dark shell cracking open, cold air, bright lights and loud voices that meant only pain. Then darkness and fear, endless fear, until a different kind of presence arrived, quiet and steady, asking for nothing. Daniel gasped and sat back so quickly the hatchling startled awake, blinking up at him with wide golden eyes. "What was that?" he said aloud, his heart pounding. The chamber's monitoring system, which recorded every fluctuation in the hatchling's biology, immediately flagged an unusual spike in neural activity. Within minutes, 3 healers rushed back into the room, scanning devices already raised. "There," one of them said sharply, staring at her datapad. "A telepathic imprint. Faint, but unmistakable." Richthin, who had returned just in time to witness the readings, went very still. "Impossible," he said quietly. "Hatchlings do not form imprints with lesser species. It has never happened in recorded history." "It just happened," the younger healer said, her voice caught somewhere between fear and astonishment. Daniel looked down at the hatchling, who now gazed back up at him with an expression that, for the first time since he had met it, did not look afraid at all. It looked, strangely, like trust. "I don't understand what just happened," Daniel admitted, his voice unsteady. Richthen's eyes narrowed, and though he said nothing further that night, something in his posture had changed, the quiet resentment hardening into something closer to alarm. Whatever bond had just formed between the dying hatchling and this ordinary human laborer, it was no longer something that could be quietly ignored or dismissed. By morning, the report would reach every corner of the Dominion's ruling council, and the peaceful, uncertain days Daniel had spent simply sitting beside a frightened creature were about to come to an abrupt and complicated end. News of the imprint spread through the upper levels of the Dominion faster than any official statement could contain it. By the time Daniel was summoned back to the council chamber, he could feel the difference in how people looked at him in the corridors. Where before there had been curiosity, now there was something closer to unease, as though he had become a problem too large for anyone to fully understand. The council chamber was fuller than the last time he had stood there. More members had arrived, along with several healers, including Richthen, who stood near the front with his arms folded and his expression carved from stone. "The imprint must be severed," Richthen said the moment Daniel entered, not bothering with formalities. "It is a corruption of the bloodline. A hatchling's mind should never be shaped by a lesser species. Left unchecked, it could affect the hatchling's development, its abilities, even its loyalty to the Dominion itself." "You don't know that," Daniel said before he could stop himself. Every head in the room turned toward him. "You're guessing. You've never seen this happen before, so you don't actually know what it means." "I know enough," Richthen snapped. "I know that our sacred bloodlines were never meant to bond with laborers pulled from a species barely 3 years into the Dominion. There are procedures for correcting this. Difficult procedures, yes, but necessary ones. Procedures that could kill it," said a healer near the back of the room, her voice hesitant but clear. "Or leave it changed in ways we cannot predict." An older Draukari woman near the far end of the table finally spoke, her voice calm amid the rising tension. Daniel recognized her from earlier meetings as one of the quieter council members, someone who mostly listened rather than argued. Her name, he had since learned, was Vanna, a scholar who had spent much of her long life studying the Dominion's oldest records. "There is precedent for this," Vanna said, drawing surprised looks from around the table. "Rare and largely forgotten, but it exists. In the earliest records of our people, before the caste system solidified, there are accounts of hatchlings bonding outside their own species during moments of extreme vulnerability. It was never considered corruption. It was considered survival." Richthen's expression darkened. "Ancient myths are not medical guidance. Neither is fear disguised as tradition," Vanna replied evenly. The blue-scaled council leader raised a hand for silence, and the room settled, though the tension remained thick enough to feel. She turned her sharp eyes toward Daniel. "You have heard both positions," she said. "What do you believe should happen?" Daniel hesitated. He had never expected to have a voice in a room like this, let alone be asked to weigh in on decisions that shaped the fate of an ancient species' most valuable bloodline. But he thought of the hatchling curled against his side each night, the fear that had finally begun to fade from its eyes, the small trusting weight of it resting in his lap. "I'm not a scientist," he said slowly. "I don't understand telepathy or bloodlines or any of your traditions. But I've spent my whole life around creatures too small or too scared to explain what's wrong with them. And I know fear when I see it. That hatchling wasn't dying from some sickness your healers couldn't diagnose. It was dying because it was terrified and alone, and nobody around it knew how to just be still and let it feel safe." He looked directly at Richthen. "You keep calling this a corruption, but maybe it's the first honest thing that's happened to that hatchling since it hatched." Silence followed his words, heavy and uncertain. Even Richthen seemed momentarily unsure how to respond. The council leaders studied Daniel for a long moment before turning to address the room. "This matter is too significant for this council alone to decide. The bloodline in question carries weight beyond politics or pride. I will not authorize a procedure that risks the hatchling's life without greater certainty, nor will I dismiss the concerns of our medical caste without proper review." She paused, glancing toward a door at the far end of the chamber that Daniel had not noticed before, tall and sealed with markings unlike anything else in the room. "This decision will be brought before the sovereign," she said finally. A ripple of surprise moved through the chamber. Even Richthen straightened, some of the certainty draining from his expression. The sovereign has not addressed council matters directly in over a decade, one of the other members murmured. Then it seems, the leader said, this is the sort of matter significant enough to change that. Daniel did not fully understand what it meant, only that the weight in the room had shifted into something far heavier than before. As the council began preparing formal notice to be sent to whatever authority stood above even this chamber, Daniel found himself thinking not of politics or bloodlines, but of a small, frightened creature waiting for him back in a quiet containment chamber, unaware that its fate was about to be placed in the hands of someone neither of them had ever met. The journey to the sovereign's chamber took nearly a full day, though Daniel was told the actual distance was short. Formalities, protocols, and layers of ceremonial preparation stretched a simple walk across the station into a slow procession of guards, advisors, and healers, all moving with the careful precision of people who understood exactly how rare this occasion was. Daniel carried the hatchling himself, wrapped loosely in a warmed cloth the medical staff had provided, its small body pressed against his chest. It had grown noticeably stronger over the past days, though it still tired easily, and the healers had agreed, reluctantly, that separating it from Daniel now would likely undo whatever progress had been made. The chamber, when they finally reached it, was unlike anything else Daniel had seen aboard the station. No harsh lighting, no rows of officials seated behind curved tables. Instead, tall windows lined one wall, looking out onto the endless dark of space, and the room itself felt strangely quiet, almost peaceful, despite the number of people gathered along its edges. At the center of the room, seated on a low platform rather than any grand throne, was the sovereign. Daniel had expected, somehow, something more imposing. Instead, the sovereign appeared almost gentle in bearing, an ancient Draucary whose scales had faded to a soft silver gray with age, whose eyes held the tired patience of someone who had watched empires rise and fall more times than most species could count. And yet the moment those eyes turned toward Daniel, he understood immediately why every guard in the room stood a little straighter. So, the sovereign said, voice quiet but carrying easily through the chamber, this is the human who has caused so much disagreement among my council. I didn't mean to cause trouble, Daniel said honestly, the same words he had offered days ago to a group of council members who had seemed far less patient than the figure before him now. Trouble, the sovereign repeated, something almost like amusement flickering across their expression. No, I do not think that is quite the right word for what you have done. The sovereign's gaze shifted to the hatchling in Daniel's arms, and for a long moment, silence filled the chamber as the ancient Draucary studied the small creature with an intensity that made even Richthen, standing near the back with the other healers, go still. Bring it closer, the sovereign said. Daniel stepped forward carefully, kneeling as the guards gestured for him to do, until the hatchling was close enough for the sovereign to reach. Rather than touching it immediately, the sovereign simply watched, patient and unhurried, as the hatchling stirred against Daniel's chest and slowly opened its golden eyes. It did not flinch. It did not cry out, the way it had with every other Draucary who had approached it since its hatching. Instead, it looked at the sovereign with quiet curiosity, and after a moment, extended one small clawed foot toward them, an unmistakable gesture of trust. A murmur rippled through the gathered officials. Even Richthen's stern expression faltered slightly. Remarkable, the sovereign murmured. It has not rejected me, and yet it does not reach for me the way it reaches for you. Their eyes returned to Daniel. Do you understand why that is? No, Daniel admitted. I don't understand any of this. The sovereign was quiet for a moment, considering. Our hatchlings, in the earliest days of our history, before the Dominion grew into what it is now, did not simply bond with whichever Draucary happened to raise them. They chose. Something within them recognized qualities that could not be taught through ceremony or title. Patience, honesty, a willingness to simply be present, without demanding anything in return. The sovereign's gaze drifted briefly toward Richthen and the other healers before returning to Daniel. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that healing is not only a matter of knowledge and skill, it is also a matter of presence, of trust freely given, not commanded. The hatchling made a soft sound and pressed closer against Daniel, and in that instant, something passed silently through the room, a faint pulse of emotion that Daniel realized, with startled clarity, was not only in his own mind. The hatchling's fear, and then its relief, and beneath both, something warm and simple that felt very much like gratitude, brushed briefly against the thoughts of everyone gathered in the chamber. Several officials gasped. Even the sovereign's composed expression shifted, something like quiet wonder passing across their ancient features. "This bond is no corruption," the sovereign said finally, their voice carrying clear authority now. "It is a truth our own traditions had simply forgotten how to recognize. I will not see it severed." Rick then opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it again beneath the weight of the sovereign's steady gaze. "The human," the sovereign continued, "will be recognized as the hatchling's bonded guardian, protected under the oldest laws of our people, laws written long before caste and hierarchy replaced trust and instinct. Magistrate Healer Rick Than, your authority in this matter ends here." Rick then bowed stiffly, his jaw tight, but he said nothing further. Daniel, still kneeling with the hatchling held close against him, barely understood the full weight of what had just been decided. He only knew that the trembling in the small body he carried had finally, completely stilled, and for the first time since this entire strange journey began, it felt like something good had actually happened. 3 weeks after the sovereign's judgment, Daniel stood in a garden he never would have imagined existed aboard a space station, watching a small dragon chase a beam of reflected light across the grass with far more energy than any dying creature should have had just a month earlier. The garden had been quietly added to his new quarters, a private courtyard tucked near the upper residential levels, the kind of space normally reserved for high-ranking Draucari families. Daniel still felt strange walking through it some mornings, half expecting someone to tell him there had been a mistake, that a maintenance worker from Earth had no business living somewhere like this. Nobody ever did. The hatchling, now strong enough to run and tumble and occasionally set small potted plants on fire when it sneezed too enthusiastically, had grown noticeably since that first terrible day in the containment chamber. Its scales had shifted from the dull, sickly gray of illness into a deep, healthy green, flecked faintly with gold near the edges, matching, Daniel had noticed with quiet amusement, almost exactly the color of its eyes. It still had no. Vanda arrived that afternoon, as she often did now, carrying a data pad filled with old records and an expression of genuine warmth that Daniel had come to appreciate more than he expected to. "The council has asked," she said, settling onto a bench near the garden's edge, "whether you and the sovereign might choose a name together. It would carry meaning, both to our people and to yours." Daniel watched the hatchling flop dramatically onto its back in the grass, legs waving in the air, entirely unbothered by the significance of the moment. "I don't know much about Draucari naming traditions," he admitted. "Then perhaps that is exactly why it should be simple," Vanda said. "Something honest. Something that does not try too hard to sound important." Later that evening, Daniel sat with the sovereign in the same quiet chamber where everything had changed weeks earlier. Between them, the hatchling dozed contentedly, worn out from a full day of chasing light and knocking over garden furniture. "You have thought of something," the sovereign said, watching him with that same patient curiosity from before. "Just an idea," Daniel said. "Back on Earth, there's an old word people used for someone who stays with you through hard times, no matter what. Someone steady. I thought maybe something close to that, in your language, might fit." The sovereign considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then let it be so." The name they chose that evening was simple, easy to say in both languages, carrying no grand titles or ancient weight, only the quiet meaning behind it. Word of it spread quickly, not because the name itself was remarkable, but because of what it represented, a bloodline heir of the Draucari, formally named through the joint decision of the sovereign and a human laborer, a thing that had never happened before in the Dominion's long history. Across the station, and soon across the wider Dominion, the story spread in different forms, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes softened, but always circling back to the same simple truth. A dying hatchling had rejected every powerful healer sent to save it, and had instead chosen an ordinary human who knew nothing about dragons, only how to sit quietly with something frightened until it felt safe enough to trust again. Humans across the Dominion, long treated as little more than convenient labor, found themselves regarded differently in the weeks that followed, not through any grand declaration, but through the quiet accumulation of small moments, questions asked instead of orders given, curiosity replacing dismissal. "It does not remember to be afraid of me," Rick then said quietly, almost to himself. "Maybe it never needed to be," Daniel replied, without malice. Rick then said nothing further, but he did not leave immediately either, watching for a long while as the small dragon eventually grew bored and wandered back toward Daniel, pressing its head affectionately against his leg. That night, as the station settled into its quiet evening cycle, Daniel sat once more in the garden beneath the artificial stars projected across the high ceiling. The hatchling curled contentedly beside him, its breathing slow and even, nothing at all like the desperate gasping cries that had first drawn him into this strange, impossible story. He thought of the little clinic back on Earth, the frightened animals he had once cared for in a world that had no idea alien empires even existed. He never could have imagined this was where that simple, quiet skill would eventually lead him. Somewhere above the station, in the vast dark reaches of space, the Dominion continued turning through its ancient rhythms of tradition and hierarchy. But here, in this small garden, something new had quietly taken root, a bond built not on bloodlines or titles, but on patience and honesty, and the simple, powerful act of choosing to stay. The galaxy, though it did not yet fully realize it, would never look at humanity quite the same way again.